Yeah. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. But nevertheless, I really looked. And so I got all these pieces. Rabbi had all these pieces. We discussed them for years. And then one day we're sitting together in San Antonio and he said, you know, I think that our problem is that we're doing it in 3 years. It should be done in 3.5 years. So we had this argument back and forth why it doesn't make logical sense that it'd be 3.5 years. It makes sense that it would go on a year boundary, blah, 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 back and forth, back and forth. And finally he said, no, the reason it's good is because it means 2 cycles fit in a 7-year period. I got slapped in the face at that point. I said, wow. Wow. I said, well, Rabbi, that means we've been doing it wrong. He goes, well, yeah, we've been doing 3 years. We should be doing 3.5 years. But what do you mean we've been doing it wrong? I said, we're not at the right place.
Sure.
So what do you mean by that? I said, well, we're in whatever book we were in.
Right.
Deuteronomy, for example. I said, but if it really is 3.5 years long and 2 of them fit into a Shmita cycle, then we know we have to start at the beginning of a Shmita cycle.
Right, exactly.
And since we're in a Shmita year, we should be in Genesis.
We should be at the beginning.
Okay, so, and the rabbi, it was like the lights were coming on. Dang, that's another question answered. You know, we're finally putting the pieces together, and
Sure.
And the lights are coming on. So we switched over to the 3.5 year cycle starting the next week. And we started focusing on now, how do we line up the Psalms and the Ashlamatot
Very good.
properly? Because that was the whole work of Yaakov Mahan in his book, The Bible is Read and Preached in the Old Synagogue.
Very good.
His book was all about how do we choose the right Ashlamatot.
Right.
And he said, his groundbreaking, I think, observation is, looking at all the possibilities, it seems clear that it's similar to what they did in the Midrash Tanhuma,
Right.
which is to take a critical word out of the Torah portion and use that as the focus of the Ashlamata,
Sure.
to use that as the focus of the Psalm, and then to use that as the focus of the Dras that we're going to give as a shir in the sermon,
Sure.
in our sermon.
Right.
So we spent a lot of time trying to coax those pieces out. But in the beginning, it was lots of authors, from Adolf Buechler at the very beginning to others, had mentioned.
Had little pieces.
Well, no, but they also said, there's some indication it should be 3.5 years.
Oh, well, I saw this in Encyclopedia Judaica. I wasn't near smart enough to figure it out. After you look at it, you think, the old cliche, I could have had a V8.
Yeah.
You think, wow, how dumb am I? You can look at it. It says one cycle starts in Nisan and one starts in Tishrei. You know you have the Shmita cycle. So it's like, what's not the figure here, you know?
Well, coming round circle back to the beginning now, as soon as we realized it was a Shmita cycle and 2 3.5 year cycles, this bimodality of the months suddenly came into sharp focus as a practical, how do I carry this out?
Right. The key element.
The more you look at it, the more you see the pieces start to dovetailing. It's so good that you can even say, wow, I'm off.
Yeah.
I'm off a little bit. I should have combined readings here instead of combining readings here,
Right.
because it's quite obvious that if I do it here, then these pieces and these pieces start lining up instead of being off again.
But let's settle on that for just a second. What you said is these should be combined. You were taking a reading from over here and then readjusting pieces and taking pieces just at will. You knew that you're on the right schedule, but the synchronization of the schedule has to do with the fact that there can be combined readings. This is not new to triennial or anything. We do the same thing in the annual, right?
Right.
So this is not a manipulation or something new that you guys decided to come up with so that you can make it all work out.
Indeed.
You just saw, here's the material. We didn't quite understand and comprehend exactly where it fit out. And then after you move through a bit, you say, oh, then here we made the mistake in the comprehension of how the material works.
Yeah.
Right?
So we have, if you will, 2 consecutive readings. At some point, I'm going to have more readings than I have year to fit them in.
Exactly.
So I'm going to have to combine. The question is, where do I combine?
Exactly.
And the Chacham put his experience to work and made combinations. And over the space of the, I suppose 7 years now that we've been doing this, it's become obvious that he was about 99% accurate. We've made one or two minor we shouldn't have combined it this week, we should have combined it the next week.
Sure.
Really tiny changes. He is so stinking close on everything that it became really obvious as we read and as we understood more of the pieces. So one of the things that I did is I took the Nisan cycle, the Tishri cycle, and I wrote all the readings down in a column, another column for those, put them together, and I looked at them side by side. And I said, now, what is the essential subject matter of this spring cycle, and what is the essential subject matter of this fall cycle?
Very good.
You want to know how often they were identical, subject-wise?
It's amazing, isn't
Just
it?
absolutely amazing. And if that wasn't blowing you away, if you looked at the theme of the reading in the annual cycle, it was almost always an exact match with the theme of the triennial cycle.
Is that right?
So this is not accidental.
Sure.
These pieces were all designed very, very carefully. Now, how do we know the right Torah portions to use?
Well, that was going to be my question, because His Eminence uses a phrase, probably, it's not a phrase necessarily that he coined, but it's like, how do we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? And I'm sure that really is significant for the work that you guys have done, because it's like taking a piece of that eggshell and saying, okay, it's white on one side and it's white on the other, but how does it fit?
Indeed. So there's a couple of different things. Maybe that one. Let me show another one. Two different books that both have key clues. They're both based on what are called the Masoretic text. So I'm going to use this one because the print is slightly bigger. If you open it up to the Torah portion, it has the Masoretic markings. I don't know whether y'all can see it, but
it probably will be difficult.
Close to where my finger is, in the column outside of the text, is an enlarged Samek. And that is the symbol that the Masoretes use to delineate a new reading. So you'll find that, for example, the first reading goes from Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 2:3.
2:3, yeah.
And so the second reading begins in Genesis 2:4. And so if you look at Genesis 2:4, you find that a Samek is at that point.
Right.
So when
this is already all encoded in here. It's not something we have to look at or fabricate
or make up. Everything is there. All I did was I reached in and I pulled them out one by one. And all I was really doing was retracing the steps that Adolf Buechler had done in his seminal work back in the Jewish Quarterly Review of 1894.
Right.
And what he did, it was published in the Jewish Encyclopedia, and it just took simply where the Sameks are and wrote them down and said, here's the triennial cycle. It's been preserved by our sages since it was used during temple days.
Right.
This is not magic.
Right. So there's all the material, of course, that's there, all the pieces of the puzzle. But this just the pieces. Of course, it's not a difficulty to understand the Torah reading sequentially. But now the difficult part is taking these other Ashlamatot, and of course, if we're going to then incorporate Nazarene codicil into this, then of course each time that you want to find the additional material that is accompanying that, the problem gets compounded. Because finding this and then tracing that all out, it's difficult enough as it is, and then you have an established foundation. But so what? You don't have the rest of the house. I need the rest of the house if I'm going to have something that I can live in. So finding the Ashlamatot, how difficult is that? How hard is that? We have some of that material is rabbinically established already. Was the triennial material like that? Was it already there, or did we have to rely on other research? How did we get to the place that we understand that the accompanying readings, the Ashlamatot and the Psalms and all of those things, and as we progress, the Nazarene Codicil, how do we figure out how to get all of that material put together in this neat little package that His Eminence sends us every week?
Okay, so that was disregarding the Nazarene Codicil, getting the right Ashlamata lined up with the right Torah portion was a problem. Adolf Fiedler and Yaakov Mann in their research, primarily using the Geniza fragments, which came from that special crypt in Egypt, where Alexandria, Egypt, I think, where all these old, worn-out books and scrolls had been stored. They pulled them out and they went through them, and one of the things that they noticed is that there might be 5, 4, 3, 2 traditions on what was the right Ashlamata for every one of the Torah portions.
So we do what? We use them all, or what do we do with them?
Part of our problem is that we in the West have an Occidental mind. We use the left brain. And that left brain forces us in so many ways to be individualistic.
Right, exactly.
And one of the individualistic tendencies is we want a one-for-one correspondence.
Right.
We're not satisfied with ambiguity, one to multiple. We find it difficult from our psyche to live with it. If we had an Oriental mind, if we used the right brain part of our head, we'd have no trouble saying, okay, so there's 5 pieces, so we deal with 5 pieces, no problem. So Israel is that confluence between the Oriental and the Occidental mind.
Sure.
They really literally balance and have no trouble having an individual part or putting multiple parts together and living with how do we make those work.
Sure.
So in general, the rule is, if you see multiple rabbinic opinions, say for example in the Talmud, the answer is they're all right. The question is, when do I use each one?
Very good.
So when we were confronted with multiple Ashlamatot, the question we're having to answer is, when do I use this one? When do I use that one? Are they related? For example, do I use a different one in the spring cycle and a different one in the fall cycle? Or do I use a different one when it comes close to this holiday, or a different one when it comes closer to a Rosh Chodesh? You know, how are they used?
Right.
And that's the subject of our research, is trying to figure this out. Now, Yaakov Mann, in his book, his way of deciding was really, really nice. He said, it is plain from the Midrash Tanhuma and the way it has been done in the past that it's based on a key word found in one of the first 2 verses of the Torah portion that is the subject of the Aslamata and the subject of the Psalm.
Right.
So we're going to look at, he went through meticulously in what I consider a highly boring book. Looking at and weighing the opinions between this one and that one, and then finally settling on and saying, based on the verbal tally, this one seems to have the closest connection.
Okay, we call that connection a verbal tally.
Correct.
Okay, so just for them that may not be familiar what a verbal tally is, we're not counting words, although Sopharim scribes do count words, but this tally that we're looking for is 2 matching set of phrases that are in the two different pieces of material, and they match, and so we know that because we have a matching set of words that these 2 pieces should be read in harmony with one another.
Indeed, 100%. So,
and they, of course, as you've experienced, they just jump off the page and say, here I am, there's no problem. Anybody reads it, they're right there, and they'll jump up for them.
And they can be validated. It's like,